after I refused to help my brother. My family kicked me out of the house, and that was their biggest mistake. My name is Cassey Ho, and I never thought I'd be standing on the front porch of my parents' house on Thanksgiving, holding a homemade pecan tart in one hand and a bouquet of autumn flowers in the other, only to be told I wasn't welcome inside. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the door. He simply stood there, arms crossed, looked me in the eye, and said, "You chose your brand over your brother, so you can keep your brand, but you're no longer part of this family." Behind him, I saw my mother trying not to cry, and just over her shoulder, my younger brother Ethan watching with the same cold expression he always wore when he got what he wanted. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just turned, walked back to my car, and left, knowing they had no idea what I'd been preparing in the months before that moment. I grew up in Orange County, California, in a house that always looked perfect from the outside. White painted trim, manicured lawn, lemon trees blooming in the backyard. My parents, David and Vivian Ho, were hard-working second-generation immigrants who prized two things above all else: respect and appearances. My father worked in real estate, mostly commercial, while my mother had once been a high school guidance counselor before retiring early to support Ethan's creative pursuits. I was their firstborn, the practical one, the rule follower. Ethan came 4 years later, and from the moment he arrived, it felt like the balance in our family shifted. If I brought home straight A's, my parents would nod politely and tell me to keep it up. When Ethan turned in a class project a week late, but with a flashy video and custom graphics, he'd get a standing ovation at the dinner table. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, that maybe he needed more encouragement, more support. But the pattern never broke. He was the risk-taker, the artist, the dreamer. I was the foundation that quietly kept the family functioning. By the time I graduated from UCLA with a degree in product design, I had already begun mapping out the concept for what would eventually become Core Form, my direct-to-consumer line of eco-conscious activewear built around inclusive sizing and sustainable materials. I spent 2 years working full-time at a boutique design agency while running pop-ups on weekends, hand-sewing early prototypes in my garage and personally packing every order. Meanwhile, Ethan dropped out of 3 different programs: film, music business, and finally digital marketing before announcing at a family dinner that he was launching his own streetwear label. My parents clapped as if he'd just secured funding from Silicon Valley. They drained half their retirement to set him up with a live work loft in downtown LA and a branding consultant. I don't think they even asked to see his business plan. Despite the disparity in support, I never resented them. Not really. I thought if I just worked hard enough, eventually they'd see my effort as something worth celebrating. By year 3, Coreform was turning a steady profit. We'd been featured in Refinery 29 and Shape. Our Instagram community was growing fast, with micro-influencers organically sharing their real bodies in our gear. I reinvested everything back into the company, hiring a production lead, expanding our sizing, improving our fabric blend. My parents remained polite, occasionally asking how my little project was going. Ethan, on the other hand, had gone through 3 rebrands, burned through 2 new investors, and was now pitching something called artivism to private angel funds, some vague intersection of activism and luxury hoodies that never seemed to materialize into inventory. The night before the confrontation, I'd received a text from my mother asking if I could arrive early to help set the table. I showed up with food, flowers, and a fragile sense of optimism that maybe this year things would feel more balanced. Instead, I walked into a staged ambush. Ethan was already seated, his laptop open, a packet of documents beside him. My parents looked serious, almost businesslike. He launched into a practiced pitch. His new label was gaining traction, but a warehouse fire and cash flow issues had put them at risk of losing a key supplier. He needed $750,000 to close the deal, and he wanted me to leverage Coreform's vendor relationships, fulfillment center, and mailing list to bridge the gap. I listened carefully, then asked the only question that mattered. "Are you asking me to hand over my infrastructure to save your company?" He shrugged. "It's not like I'm asking for money. It's collaboration. We're family." When I refused calmly, clearly, with all the boundaries I'd learned to hold over the years, he looked at me like I'd punched him. My parents sat in silence. Then my father cleared his throat and said, "If you won't help your brother, you're turning your back on this family, and we can't support that." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum disguised as a dinner, and I had just given them the wrong answer. I didn't leave right away after that dinner. I helped clear the dishes, exchanged small talk with my aunt, even listened to my cousin's daughter play a shaky version of Fur Elise on the piano. But the energy had shifted. My father avoided eye contact, and my mother's smiles were forced, brittle at the edges. Ethan disappeared into the den, muttering something about checking an investor email, and I sat there for another hour, surrounded by warmth that no longer felt mine. When I finally stood to go, my mother handed me a Tupperware of leftovers and kissed my cheek like she didn't know whether she'd see me again. I walked out into the cool November air with my hands full and my heart hollow. It wasn't until I got to my car that I realized I was still clutching a folded napkin in one fist like some kind of anchor I hadn't noticed holding on to. Over the next few days, I tried to push the conversation to the back of my mind. Work was ramping up. We had a holiday campaign launching, influencer partnerships scheduled, and a potential licensing deal with a wellness retreat in Ojai. But the silence from my family was deafening. Usually, my mom would text the day after any gathering with photos, jokes, or a leftover pie recipe. Nothing. My father, who rarely messaged, didn't even send his usual article link about small business trends. Ethan, unsurprisingly, stayed quiet. I told myself it was tension that would pass, like so many strained moments had before. But that illusion cracked wide open when I received a certified letter 2 weeks later. The return address was my parents' home. Inside was a formal notice, drafted by a law firm, informing me that I had been removed as a secondary beneficiary from their estate. There was no personal note, no explanation. Just a line at the bottom stating that all assets, effective immediately, would be passed to Ethan Ho in the event of their passing. I stared at it for so long my coffee went cold. Even then, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was numb, confused. I showed the letter to Jules, my longtime friend and head of partnerships at Coreform. She read it twice, quietly, then looked up and said, "They're cutting you out to punish you." I nodded. I guess I was never really in. That night, I scrolled through years of family photos stored on my phone, birthday cakes I'd baked, gifts I'd hand-wrapped, moments I'd captured at dinner tables and beach trips and living room Christmas mornings, trying to convince myself I belonged in them. I had always believed that showing up, being dependable, and building something meaningful would eventually earn me a place of equal value. But now, it was brutally clear. Loyalty in my family was transactional, and I had failed to pay the expected price. The following weekend, I ran into Mrs. Yvonne Lee, our old neighbor, at the Saturday farmers market. She was warm as always, full of compliments about my business and questions about my parents. "They said you've been too busy to attend family events lately," she said with a tilt of the head. I smiled politely but said nothing. Later that day, I heard from an old family friend that Ethan had been at a networking mixer bragging that Coreform was on its way out and that I was probably going to pivot to wellness coaching or something more manageable. The words felt like a punch, but what hit harder was the realization that he was actively trying to sabotage me while the rest of the family chose to believe him. The narrative was shifting fast, and I was being written out not just legally but emotionally, socially, and symbolically. I didn't sleep much after that, at work. I made it through meetings and launches, but I was on edge, double-checking inventory emails, bracing for something to fall apart. Then, it did. 2 of our smaller suppliers suddenly requested early contract termination, citing uncertainty about the company's direction. One of our fulfillment partners asked whether we'd still be operating through Q2. Confused. I dug deeper and learned that Ethan had approached them quietly through a shell entity, floating the idea that he'd be acquiring our assets soon. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a premeditated attempt to destabilize my business from within. I met with my attorney, Mr. Carpenter, a quiet, methodical man who had handled our early incorporation paperwork. After I explained everything, he leaned back, fingers steepled, and said, "You need to document everything, every email, every whisper, every move they make. This isn't personal anymore, Cassey. This is strategic, and you're a target." That night, I created a folder labeled Crisis on my desktop. Inside, I saved screenshots, call logs, legal documents, and a timeline of events. My therapist would later call this a trauma response. I just called it survival. Thanksgiving came. Against my better judgment, I drove to my parents' house with the same tart I'd made every year since I was 16. The lights were on. Cars lined the street. Laughter drifted through the open windows. When I knocked, my father answered. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just said, "You're not welcome here. Cassey, you made your choice." From behind him, I saw Ethan standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. "That's Amanda," my mother said coolly. "They got married last month. I hadn't even been told. I wasn't invited." The realization hit harder than I expected. I turned to leave, placing the tart gently on the doorstep, and as I walked back to my car, I realized something had shifted inside me. Not broken, not bitter, but sharpened. I had tried playing by their rules. I had tried love, effort, and loyalty. Now, it was time for strategy. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even Jules. Something about the humiliation was too raw to share, too personal to unpack over coffee or Slack messages. But I couldn't afford to freeze, not emotionally, not professionally. Ethan wasn't just trying to outshine me. He was trying to erase me slowly, methodically, and with a confidence that suggested he believed I wouldn't fight back. That belief was his first mistake. I started small, quiet. I contacted a corporate investigator David Carpenter had once referred me to during a due diligence deal. Her name was Aria Chin, and she worked discreetly out of an office above a print shop in Koreatown. I met her there on a rainy Monday afternoon, handed over a printed packet of names, timelines, and questions, and said simply, "I need to know how far this goes." Within 10 days, Aria had compiled a 30-page dossier. Most of it confirmed what I already suspected. Ethan's company had no working capital, no inventory, and no clear business model. But what stood out, buried on page 16, was a paper trail connecting my parents directly to his latest funding round. They hadn't just given him money, they had co-signed a high-risk business loan using their primary residence as collateral. That explained the urgency. That explained the desperation. My parents weren't just protecting their favorite child, they were protecting themselves. If Ethan's company collapsed, they'd lose their home. At first, the discovery made me sick to my stomach. For years, I had believed their loyalty to Ethan was emotional, but now I saw that it was financial too. Their investments were tangled up in his failures, and I was the variable they couldn't control. That night, I lay awake for hours, watching the ceiling fan spin, piecing it all together. Ethan hadn't come to me with a collaboration pitch. He came with a bailout plea wrapped in family language, and when I refused, he activated the only leverage he had: our parents' fear, pride, and sense of appearance. But even so, I couldn't bring myself to retaliate with malice. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, and I wanted protection. David Carpenter and I met for lunch 2 days later at a quiet cafe near his office. I showed him Aria's report and waited as he read through it, page by page, his brow furrowing deeper with each section. When he finally looked up, he said, "If this blows up, your parents won't just lose money. They could face a foreclosure review depending on how the loan was structured." I nodded slowly, letting that sink in. Then I asked the question I'd been circling for days. Is there a legal way to shield them while still shielding myself? He blinked. "You want to protect them?" "Yes," I said without hesitation, but not without conditions. David leaned forward and began sketching a structure on a napkin. We could create a business trust, a third-party entity that would quietly purchase their debt from the lender in the secondary market. The ownership would be anonymous, filed under the Hartwell Consolidated Trust, a name close enough to my brand to feel familiar but not traceable without digging. It would take capital, time, and careful paperwork. But it would work. I would become their new lender. Quietly, strategically, completely. It wasn't about power. It was about leverage, because once I held the paper, I could finally set terms of my own. The process took 6 weeks during that time. I continued running Coreform as usual, but behind the scenes, I worked with my financial advisor to free up liquid assets, paused non-essential marketing campaigns, and delayed our new product drop. No one suspected a thing. Ethan continued spreading rumors about my store being for sale, unaware that I was working with his creditors. My parents, still cold and silent, probably believed they had shut me out for good. I answered no calls, ignored passive-aggressive texts from my mother about choices and consequences, and poured every ounce of energy into ensuring I could withstand what was coming. By early January, the deal was done. The mortgage was transferred. The note was in my hands. I was officially the lien holder on my parents' house, and they had no idea. It was a strange feeling, powerful and hollow at the same time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post anything. I simply emailed David and said, "Let me know when it's time." His reply was short. "They'll receive notice from the trust within 5 business days. We'll call them in for a formal meeting the following week." I closed my laptop and took a long walk around the reservoir, the winter wind sharp against my face, trying to convince myself I wasn't crossing a line I'd regret, but I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was giving them one last chance to see what fairness could look like, if they ever cared to look. When I got back to my apartment, Jules was waiting. She looked at me and said, "Whatever you're doing, I hope it's worth it." I just nodded. "I'm not trying to win anymore," I told her quietly. "I'm just done playing by rules that were never meant to protect me." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept through until morning. The letter went out on a Monday. It was written in the most neutral, clinical tone possible. It stated that their mortgage had been transferred to a new servicing entity under Hartwell Consolidated Trust and requested a formal review meeting at David Carpenter's office later that week. It didn't name me. It didn't imply threat. It was worded the way all financial letters are worded: calm, bureaucratic, and quietly unsettling. I knew the moment they received it. My phone buzzed twice from my father, once from my mother, and then came a flurry of text messages, short and confused. "What is this about? Why are we being audited? Is this some kind of scam I didn't answer?" I forwarded everything to David, who confirmed the appointment time for Friday afternoon. When I walked into his office at 2:45 that day, my heart was steady. My palms weren't even sweating. I had rehearsed this moment 100 different ways, but in the end, I said almost nothing. I let the facts speak for themselves. My parents arrived exactly at 3, dressed as if attending a funeral. My mother's blouse was perfectly pressed, her lipstick a shade too red. My father wore the same navy blazer he'd worn to Ethan's college graduation. They both looked around the room warily, only relaxing slightly when David greeted them with a polite handshake and ushered them into the conference space. I stayed behind the glass door for a full minute before entering. When I did, they turned in unison. My mother's mouth fell open slightly. My father's expression flickered from confusion to disbelief. I took the empty chair across the table and placed a folder in front of me without saying a word. David cleared his throat and began. He explained the basics first. The mortgage had been purchased legally through a secondary debt acquisition, a common practice during financial restructuring cycles. The new lender, Hartwell Trust, had every right to request a full disclosure meeting regarding payment terms, risk reassessment, and potential adjustment options. My father interrupted. His voice clipped. "Why weren't we told this earlier?" David answered smoothly. "Loan transfers of this type often include a notification lag period. You were informed the moment the transition completed." My mother leaned forward. "But who owns this trust?" Her voice wasn't angry, it was afraid. And that's when I spoke for the first time. "I do," I said quietly. "Hartwell Trust is mine. I bought your mortgage last month." Silence filled the room so completely it pressed against the windows. My father stared at me like I had spoken in a language he didn't understand. My mother's lips trembled. David remained calm, sliding another folder across the table. "These documents outline the updated terms your daughter is offering," he said. "You are under no legal obligation to accept them, but I'd advise reviewing them thoroughly." My father didn't touch the papers. He looked at me and said, "What kind of game is this?" I met his eyes. "It's not a game. It's a choice. The same kind of choice you gave me." The folder contained 3 key adjustments. First, I would reduce their monthly payment by 15%, easing their cash flow during retirement. Second, I would forgive 20% of the principal over the next 5 years, contingent on consistent payment and no further co-signed debts for Ethan's ventures. Third, and most significant, I requested 6 sessions of family counseling together, not mandatory, but recommended. My father scoffed. My mother covered her face with both hands. The silence stretched, broken only when she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" My voice was steady. "Because I don't want you to lose your house, but I also won't let you pretend none of this happened." It wasn't about control. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Ethan had cost them their savings, their security, and nearly my livelihood, and they had chosen to protect him over and over, even when it meant cutting me out. I had no intention of evicting them, but I also wasn't going to enable another cycle of blind loyalty if they wanted protection. They had to accept truth. That afternoon, the meeting ended without signatures. My parents left in stunned silence, the folder still unopened in my father's hand. David said nothing until the door shut behind them. Then he looked at me and said, "You held that room with more grace than I've seen in 20 years of practice." I didn't answer. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean. That weekend passed without a word. Then, on Monday morning, David forwarded me a scanned document, signed, returned, accepted. They had agreed to all 3 terms. No notes, no comments, no apology, just a quiet, paper acknowledgement that the rules had changed. The next phase wouldn't be legal. It would be personal, and it would take more strength than anything I'd done so far. It didn't take long for Ethan to find out. I'm not sure whether my parents told him directly or if one of his advisors flagged something in the lending records, but within a week of their signature, he showed up at my office unannounced. He didn't come in quietly. He walked past my front counter like he owned the space, ignoring my assistant's startled greeting, and found me reviewing fabric swatches in the back studio. His expression was somewhere between disbelief and contempt, like he couldn't decide if I'd betrayed him or embarrassed him. "You bought their mortgage," he demanded. "Seriously. Cassey, what kind of psycho move is that?" I stood, slowly placing the swatches down, and looked at him without emotion. "It's a legal move," I said simply, "and it's done." He laughed, short and bitter. "You're unbelievable. You act like some moral hero while playing banker behind everyone's back." "What? You think you're saving them?" He was pacing now, words escalating. "This isn't about saving anyone. This is about control. You've always hated being second place, and now you've found a way to flip the board." His voice carried, sharp against the concrete walls. I motioned to Rachel to close the office door, then turned back to him. "You're wrong," I said calmly. "I didn't do this to win. I did it because I'm tired of being erased. You gambled with their future. I bought back their security." He stared at me for a long second, then shook his head with a twisted grin. "They'll see through you eventually," he said. "They always do." After he left, I sat down in my chair and stayed there for nearly an hour. No tears, no fury, just quiet. Because deep down, I understood something he didn't. He thought my power came from the paperwork, the signatures, the loan. But that wasn't it. The real shift had already happened long before any documents were signed. I had stopped asking for permission to exist in their world, and I wasn't going back. Later that evening, I received a text from my mother. No greeting, no punctuation, just 6 words. "Why did you humiliate your brother?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. For her. The greater crime was not his recklessness or his manipulation, but the fact that someone had finally stopped covering for it. I showed the message to my therapist the next morning. She read it silently, then asked, "Do you feel like that was meant to make you feel guilty?" I nodded. "Always." She folded her hands. What would it feel like to choose not to carry that guilt anymore? The answer was so simple it almost felt like cheating. Quiet. I said, "It would feel quiet." In the weeks that followed, Ethan's narrative began to unravel, with my parents no longer able to co-sign or invest. His credit dried up. He started missing supplier payments. 2 of his interns reached out anonymously through LinkedIn, asking if I knew whether they should be looking for new jobs. I didn't answer directly, but I forwarded their messages to David just in case. He nodded once after reading them. "He's circling the drain," he said. "It's only a matter of time." But even as Ethan's world contracted, mine kept growing. Coreform signed a new distribution deal with a boutique hotel chain in Arizona. One of our earlier investors offered to fund a pop-up concept in Seattle. And most surprisingly, I was invited to join a mentoring group for female founders navigating second-stage growth. I didn't tell my parents about any of it, not out of spite, but because I had finally accepted that they didn't want to know. Not really. They didn't want updates that didn't include Ethan's name or proximity. They didn't know how to celebrate what wasn't centered around him, and that silence had become its own answer. The day the foreclosure proceedings for Ethan's business became public, I didn't gloat. I didn't tell anyone. I simply walked into the Coreform studio, unlocked the doors, and started my work like I always did. But that night, while cleaning up the shop floor, I found something taped to the back door. It was a torn flyer for Ethan's brand, the logo barely legible under water stains, scrawled across the bottom in red marker. "You think you've won? You haven't." No signature, no camera footage, no witnesses. But I didn't need confirmation. I recognized the handwriting. I handed it to David the next morning, and he filed it as documentation. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. I shook my head. No. He's already losing the only thing that mattered to him, his illusion. The next week passed quietly. No visits, no messages, no whispers. Just silence. And in that stillness, I found something I hadn't had in years. Peace. I didn't see my parents for almost 2 months after the loan documents were signed. There were no holiday invitations, no belated calls, no olive branches, just silence that felt more deliberate with each passing week. And yet, somehow, that absence was easier than the chaos that had come before. For the first time in years, I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to play the role of the calm one, the steady one, the one who took hits without flinching. Instead, I focused on running Coreform, closing out the 4th quarter with our strongest numbers to date. When the financial reports came in, I sat alone in the office one night with a glass of wine and stared at the growth curve. It wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was grit, strategy, and years of doing the quiet work no one clapped for. Then, one Tuesday morning in early March, my assistant poked her head into my office. "There's a woman out front asking for you," she said. She didn't give a name. "But I think you'll want to see her." I stepped out into the retail space and saw my mother standing near the front window, both hands clutching her purse. Looking smaller than I remembered, her lipstick was faded, her eyes were red. I didn't speak at first. I just nodded once and motioned toward the back office. She followed silently, and when the door closed behind us, the quiet settled like fog. She didn't sit right away. She hovered, uncertain, as if waiting for a signal. Finally, she spoke. "Your father doesn't know I'm here," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He's still processing everything." I nodded, not because I understood, but because I didn't have the energy to challenge it. "I've been seeing a therapist." she continued, surprising me. Not the family one, just someone for myself. I needed to understand how we got here. I stayed silent, letting her speak. I keep thinking about what you said in that meeting, about security, about love that doesn't erase people. She paused. I think we took your strength for granted. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't that. I looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't performing. She wasn't defending Ethan or trying to guilt me into anything. She was just standing there, raw and unsure, finally aware of how much had been broken. Slowly. I motioned to the chair across from mine. She sat. We talked for almost an hour, not about the past exactly, but about patterns, about how love can be distorted by fear, about the difference between enabling and supporting. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked for a chance to try again. And maybe, in that moment, that was enough. The next week, she came back this time with 2 coffees and a small gift bag. Inside was a handmade soy candle in a scent I'd once mentioned liking years ago. I thought it might work for your shelf display. She said, we didn't talk business. We didn't talk family dynamics. We just talked about design, about her garden, about nothing and everything. It was strange how natural it felt, like we were learning how to speak a new language after years of using the wrong one. Eventually, my father called. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. He asked about interest rates and loan structures, then casually mentioned he'd seen Coreform featured in a local entrepreneur spotlight. Your numbers look solid, he said, coming from a man who had spent decades celebrating Ethan's every whim while treating my business like a side hobby. That comment landed heavier than any grand gesture. It wasn't affection, but it was acknowledgement, and for now, that was all I needed. The family therapy sessions began a few weeks later. They were awkward, tense, full of stops and starts, but they happened. We sat in a circle, said hard things, listened to harder ones, and left some sessions with more questions than answers. Ethan didn't join. He was invited, repeatedly, but always declined. I wasn't surprised. He wasn't ready to look at the story without being the hero in it. That had been true for years. And maybe that's where the real grief lived, not in the betrayal, but in the slow, dawning realization that some people don't want peace. They want control, and when they lose it, they vanish. By May, I had restructured Coreform's team, expanded into a new fulfillment center, and launched a mentorship program for young founders from marginalized backgrounds. I wasn't just running a business anymore. I was building a system that could outlast me. And in that momentum, I found healing, not from my family's apology, but from my own ability to keep moving, to keep building, even when love felt conditional, because maybe it always had been. It's a strange thing to rebuild a life that technically never fell apart. On paper, I had everything I set out to build. Coreform was healthy, profitable, and respected. I had a stable team, a loyal customer base, and enough financial runway to weather almost any storm. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't bitterness or regret. It was a quiet clarity, like waking up from a long, disorienting dream. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was supposed to be. I stopped defending choices that didn't need defending. And slowly, I started allowing new people in not as substitutes, but as something better. A chosen family. Jules was the first to notice the change. One afternoon, after a team meeting that ran a little long, she pulled me aside and said, "You seem lighter, not happy exactly, but less haunted." I smiled because she wasn't wrong. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I wasn't trying to earn my place at a table that had never been set for me in the first place. Instead, I was building a new table from scratch, one where no one had to shrink to fit. That spring, I hosted a dinner at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just a mix of friends, team members, and collaborators who had been part of my journey quietly and consistently. I cooked too much, laughed more than I expected, and for the first time in a long while, I felt surrounded not by obligation, but by respect. Toward the end of the evening, as we were clearing dishes, Rachel, My assistant turned operations lead, looked around and said, "This feels like real family energy." I didn't respond right away, I just nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by how true that felt. Meanwhile, the situation with Ethan had grown quieter, but not cleaner. His business had officially shuttered. The final notice went out in May, along with a brief article in a local tech blog titled, "From Visionary to Vanished." There were no lawsuits, no dramatic confessions, just a slow fade into irrelevance. The last I heard. He'd moved to Austin, taken a marketing job at a mid-sized brand agency, and started calling himself a creative strategist. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I didn't celebrate either. His fall wasn't my victory. It was just the logical end of a story he refused to write truthfully. My parents never spoke about it directly. At one therapy session, my father admitted that he had been naive about certain realities, which, coming from him, was essentially a full confession. My mother, more open now, said she still felt grief about how things unfolded, but also relief that the silence had been broken. "We pretended for so long that everything was fine," she said one evening after a session, "but all we did was teach you to stay quiet. That's the part I'll never stop regretting." I didn't absolve her, but I didn't punish her either. The work of healing wasn't hers alone, but it wasn't mine to carry for her anymore. Summer came fast in Orange County that year, and with it came new beginnings. Core Form launched a second location inside a lifestyle marketplace downtown, and our online store began shipping internationally. I was invited to speak at a panel about sustainable fashion at a women's business conference in San Diego, and after the event, one of the organizers pulled me aside and said, "Your story isn't just inspiring, it's quietly defiant, and I think people need more of that." That sentence stayed with me, quietly defiant. Not loud, not bitter, just clear and unshakable. I realized then that I hadn't been seeking revenge this whole time. I had been seeking peace, one built on truth, not illusion, one where boundaries were not a betrayal, but an act of self-respect. As the days got longer and the store busier, I found myself thinking less about what had been lost and more about what had been protected. My voice, my time, my company, my future. I hadn't burned the bridge to my family. I had simply stopped carrying it alone. They could walk toward me if they chose to, but I wouldn't build another one just to keep things looking pretty. The person I was before all this, the version who thought love had to be earned through sacrifice, was gone, and in her place was someone steadier, not softer, not colder, just more herself than ever before. I didn't expect my father to change overnight. He wasn't the type to unravel in public or apologize in long sentences. But something in him had shifted. He asked more questions during therapy, not just about the mortgage or Ethan's debt, but about patterns he had never thought to examine. "Do you think I favored him because I saw myself in him?" he asked once, eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't answer. He wasn't really asking me. He was asking the silence that had stretched between us for 30 years. Later that day, my mother admitted she had suspected the same thing but never dared say it out loud. "We kept telling ourselves he just needed more support," she said. But what we really meant was that we didn't believe he could stand on his own. It was the first time I heard her use the word enable. Around that same time, a letter arrived at my office. It was from the bank that had originally held my parents' mortgage. Inside was a standard notification confirming the successful transfer of their account and the termination of prior cosigner guarantees linked to Ethan's business loan. I already knew the paperwork had gone through, but seeing it in writing gave the whole thing a strange finality. I sat with the envelope in my hand for a long time. My parents were no longer legally tied to Ethan's company. The only thing left binding them was emotion. Meanwhile, Core Form was preparing for its 5th anniversary. We planned a low-key event with an artisan showcase and a storytelling night hosted by one of our longtime collaborators. I debated inviting my parents, not because I needed them there, but because something in me still wanted them to see it. Not the logo or the press or the product lines, but the community, the actual impact. I drafted the invitation 3 times before sending it. One line, no guilt, no expectation. "You're welcome to attend if it feels right." They showed up 30 minutes late. My mother wore a linen dress I didn't recognize. My father looked like someone trying hard not to fidget. I introduced them to my team, to our makers, to the customer who had driven from out of state just to be there. They smiled politely, said thank you, nodded often. I didn't ask if they were proud. I didn't need to anymore. Just before they left, my father pulled me aside. "Your projections," he said. "They're strong. But what really impressed me was how your staff speaks about you. That kind of loyalty can't be bought." Coming from him, it was the closest thing to reverence I had ever received, and it was enough. Not long after, my mother called to say they had decided to downsize. "The house is too big now," she said, "and I think we need a fresh start." They had found a smaller place near the coast, closer to her sister. She asked if I wanted to come see it. "Not today," I said gently, "but soon." She didn't sound hurt, just patient, like someone who had finally learned not to rush the process. I didn't hear anything about Ethan for weeks. Then, in mid-July, a former supplier forwarded me an email chain he had accidentally been copied on. It was from Ethan, attempting to rebrand himself as a creative consultant and proposing a collaboration involving AI-generated trend forecasting for activewear. The supplier had declined politely. Attached at the end was a short note meant for someone else. "She thinks she's won," Ethan had typed. "But wait till the market shifts. She won't see it coming." The supplier added no commentary. He just forwarded it with a one-line message. "Thought you should see this." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. If that's where he wanted to spend his energy plotting shadows while I stood in the daylight, I had nothing to fear. The version of me that would have panicked or obsessed over what he might do next didn't exist anymore. I wasn't waiting for his recognition. I wasn't trying to rescue him. I had already done more than anyone ever should have. 2 weeks later, my mother dropped by with a box of old photo albums. "We're clearing out the attic," she explained. "Thought you might want these." Inside were pictures of birthdays, beach trips, and blurry school recitals. And there, tucked in the back of one album, was a crumpled drawing I had made in 2nd grade. It was a picture of a store, big windows, a hand-lettered sign, a little girl with long hair behind the counter. In the corner, my teacher had written, "Dream big. Cassey. I hope one day this is real." I closed the album and smiled. It was the 5th anniversary of Core Form passed without drama, without a headline, without any grand toast. We sold out our new collection in under 48 hours, received press from a wellness magazine we hadn't even pitched, and had our first licensing inquiry from overseas. But more than any number, what stayed with me were the people. Customers who told us they felt seen. Staff members who said this was the first workplace where they didn't feel disposable. A former intern who returned just to say thank you for teaching her how to stand her ground in rooms where she once shrank herself down. None of that would have made sense to my brother. I stopped hoping it ever would. That fall, we held our first in-house leadership retreat at a coastal cabin in Big Sur. It was quiet, foggy, surrounded by redwoods, no cell service, just long walks, shared meals, and honest conversations. On the final night, we each had to answer one question aloud: "What have you let go of this year?" when it was my turn. I didn't hesitate. The need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. The words surprised me by how easily they came. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just said them, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for a space big enough to land in. That was the moment I realized how far I'd come. Not in distance from my family, but in distance from the version of myself who used to believe that love always had to hurt a little. That inclusion had to be earned, that success didn't count unless it impressed people who never really saw me to begin with. That version of me was long gone, not buried, but released. Around the same time, I received a letter in the mail, no return address, no signature, just a single line written in familiar handwriting: "If I disappear, don't act surprised. You always wanted the spotlight." I read it twice, then burned it in a metal dish on my balcony. I didn't tell my lawyer. I didn't document it. I didn't even save a photo. not out of fear, but because I understood it for what it was, his last attempt to pull me back into a drama I had already left behind. Sometimes silence is the only door you have to close. My parents never mentioned Ethan again, not directly, but there were signs. My father started attending the therapy sessions more willingly. My mother began volunteering at a nonprofit for immigrant entrepreneurs and sent me pictures of the women she was helping. One day, she texted me a photo of a business permit application and asked if I could review the layout. One of the women I'm working with doesn't speak much English. She wrote, "But her ideas remind me of yours." I wrote back, "Happy to help." That was it. No subtext, no wounds reopened. Just one small gesture passed between us that felt, for once, clean. By early winter, the house was finally sold. They didn't throw a farewell party. They just packed, moved, and sent me a short video of the ocean from their new porch. My mother's voice could be heard faintly in the background, saying, "It's peaceful here. It's quiet." I watched that video 3 times, not because I missed them, but because I could tell they were, for the first time, sitting still with themselves. That kind of stillness takes time to learn. The night before Christmas, they invited me to dinner. No pressure, no dramatic setup, just a table with 2 extra chairs and the option to say yes or no. I said yes, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to see what we could be now that the illusions had cracked and fallen away. I brought a bottle of wine, a small box of core-form candles, and no expectations. Dinner was quiet, simple food, small talk, no mention of the past, no inquiries about Ethan, just the 3 of us, sitting in the present. At one point, my father asked what was next for the company. I started to answer, but stopped. "You know," I said. "I think for once I'm okay with where I am." My mother smiled. It wasn't a look of pride or sentimentality, it was something else respect. Later that night, driving home through dark streets lined with holiday lights, I realized something I hadn't known I was waiting to feel. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even tired. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that needed proving. Just quietly, fully whole. It's funny how peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fireworks or closure speeches or some symbolic sunrise. It arrives quietly, like breath you didn't know you'd been holding finally exhaled. I didn't plan to forgive my family. I didn't even know if I had. But I noticed, one morning in early January, that I was no longer organizing my thoughts around them. I was planning next quarter's launch, designing a new fabric line, reviewing notes from the mentorship cohort, and not once did I pause to wonder what they'd think. That silence inside my head was more liberating than any apology could ever be. The last time I saw Ethan was almost a year to the day since he stormed into my office. He didn't speak to me. He was across the room at a startup mixer I'd been invited to as a keynote guest. He looked thinner, more tired, still clinging to the kind of charisma that had once shielded him from accountability. When our eyes met briefly across the crowd, there was no malice, just recognition. He looked away first. I left the event early and didn't mention it to anyone. There was nothing more to say, no revenge left to serve, no dignity left to win. We were 2 people who had once shared blood, a house, and years of tension so thick it shaped the architecture of who we became, but we were no longer part of each other's story, at least, not in the way that mattered. As Coreform entered its 6th year, we moved into a new studio space near the waterfront, filled with natural light and custom shelving built by a local carpenter I'd met at a craft fair. The office was quieter, more intentional. No ping-pong tables, no neon slogans, just work that felt real, and a team that believed in what we were building. Our revenue crossed 7 figures again. But that wasn't what made me proud. What mattered most was hearing my team members say they felt safe, that they didn't have to code switch, that they could bring ideas to the table without fear of being dismissed. I didn't need my family's name anymore. I had built one on my own terms. Later that spring, while cleaning out an old storage unit, I found a dusty box labeled "College Not Important." Inside were notebooks, sketches, receipts, and one envelope I had sealed and forgotten. Inside, it was a letter I'd written to myself at 21, taped to a photo of the first yoga set I had ever hand-sewn. The letter wasn't long, just a list of reminders I'd scrawled in shaky pen. Don't wait to be chosen. Build what you can't find. If they don't believe in you, go anyway. I sat with that paper in my hands for a long time. Not in sadness, not even in nostalgia, just quiet pride that I had kept going, even when no one had clapped. Sometimes, I think about that Thanksgiving morning when I stood on my parents' porch holding a pie and a bouquet and was told I was no longer part of the family. That moment used to haunt me. Now it feels like the beginning of everything, because that was the day I stopped asking for belonging in a place that only welcomed me when I was useful. That was the day I stepped fully into my own story, and I've never looked back. I know not everyone gets the arc I did. Not every door reopens. Not every parent softens. Some family fractures stay permanent, and some betrayals never get named out loud. But if you're listening to this and you've ever been the one asked to shrink, to yield, to give up your seat at the table for someone else's comfort, please know this. Your worth doesn't disappear just because they refuse to see it. You don't have to burn bridges to stop crossing them, and sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is choose peace over permission. I used to think success was the final act in the story, but it's not. The real triumph is becoming someone you're proud of when no one else is watching. Someone who honors her voice, even when it shakes. Someone who doesn't wait for an invitation to build something real. Someone who knows, deeply and quietly, that she is already enough. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who should have stood beside you? What gave you the strength to keep going? I'd love to hear your story. And if this one resonated with you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone. Because sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is choose ourselves.